Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Hamish Chalmers. I'm one of the co-directors of the Oxford Education Deanery. And our job and our mission really is to put researchers and practitioners like yourselves in contact with each other so that we can make sure that the research that we do meets the needs of people like you, and so that you can benefit from the fruits of our labours in trying to find things out and understand the world of education incrementally a little bit better each day. I'm delighted here to welcome our extremely busy and active sustainability team. Two members of that, Megan Murray-Pepper and Phoebe Mortimer, who'll be leading today's session, alongside a colleague from the Department of Education, Nicole Dingwall, who's a lecturer in English and education here with us. I just want to give you a little bit of information, a little bit more information about the Deanery while you're here. So that's the information about today's seminar. But we also have some online learning, which is free to partake in. So on the Deanery website, do go and have a look at that. I'm going to be going too quickly for the QR code, so we'll make this available afterwards. We have a knowledge hub, which includes plain language digest of the research of the university or for the department. We have a podcast series where we talk to researchers about their research and how it affects the way that we interpret research for policy and practice, and resource packs, lots of resource packs with a whole host of different things based on the research that's done in the department. We'd be very happy for you to go and explore that. We also have a mailing list to keep people like you up to date with what's going on at the Deanery, which includes a termly newsletter and then targeted emails to anyone who has said that they're interested in a particular area of research. We don't want to spam you, but if there's a research study coming up which you have said you might be interested in getting involved in, then we can let you know about that as well. So please do check out the Deanery website and sign up to the mailing list if you haven't already, and if you'd like to. We also have scholarships. There's a reduction in price to attend Deanery events, which attract a charge. Some of our in-person events, we levy a small fee for attendance, but we can reduce that right down for people who are teaching in challenging or underrepresented circumstances. So have a look out for those. And then finally, we'd love your feedback on today's webinar. And there is a link there to a feedback form, but I'm reliably informed that that will be shared with you at the end of the session as well. So I don't think it is for me to take up any more of your time, so I'd love to hand over to our conveners and guests today for the webinar on what to read for climate and nature in the classroom. Take it away, Phoebe.
Thank you.
Oh, not Phoebe, sorry, Oliver.
Thank you, Hamish. I'm actually going to start. Hi, everyone. And I'm, in fact, Megan. I'm sorry, the name on my account is different. I'm having to use my husband's team account, but I am Megan. And I'll be sort of steering you through most of the webinar today with Phoebe and Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get straight into it. And we've got a little icebreaker for you just to get a sense of maybe who's with us, and also some of the books that mean an awful lot to you. So we might be able to return to this later on, but if you could just pop in the chat a book about the living world, interpret that how you will, that you remember enjoying as a child, so a book that really kind of stayed with you. And it'd be really nice just to get a flavour from that of what kind of books are beloved in the group that's here today. So just put your reading suggestions in there, or your favourite books in there. The Secret Garden, a classic straight up. Any more very beloved books about nature and the living world? Wuthering Heights, thank you. Little House on the Prairie, a lot of classics. Oh, I don't know. Oversea Under Stone. Thank you, and just keep them flow. The Wind and the Billows, brilliant. Keep them flowing, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of check in maybe with some of the ideas that make these books so compelling when we engage with books about the natural world. We are going to hopefully show you today some ways in which you can kind of integrate and initiate some really thoughtful discussions about climate, nature and sustainability into your classroom through the book choices that you make and the way you approach reading materials in the classroom. And this definitely means going beyond texts that are all about climate and nature. So what we're going to do is to start by thinking briefly together about why we might read for climate and nature in the English classroom. And then we've got sort of 3 key sections of the webinar. The first section is going to be about looking at some of the opportunities. So we're going to hear from Nicole about research with teacher interns about what they found in their schools as opportunities. And Phoebe and I are going to talk about some particular book choices that we really recommend for the classroom. In the second section, we're going to focus more on some existing curriculum texts, and that's a bit where we're going to ask you to do some hard work as well, and to work together to think about some familiar texts in perhaps slightly less familiar ways. And in the third section, we'll hopefully have some time to run through another few eclectic kind of reading suggestions, different approaches, different categories of books that work for climate and nature, and time for questions as well. So that's our format. So just to finish off our kind of introduction with the question of why we might read for climate and nature. And again, this is something we'd really like to get some suggestions from you. Oh, I've just seen Tiddler. Great choice. Great choice of underwater worlds. And again, we'd love to hear from you about your suggestions about why we might read about climate and nature. So any reasons you think make it an important task to engage in, particularly when it comes to thinking about English. Any more suggestions in the chat? We'd love you to share, and then we'll share some of the ideas that we came up with when we've been asking ourselves these questions over the last couple of years. Why should we read about climate and nature? Great, so thank you. First comment, to inform about the climate emergency, but be mindful. Yep, definitely important to think how sensitively we teach it. Space for considering relationships with the natural world. Setting, fascinating part of how most stories are put together. Green careers. Some great ideas coming in. Thank you. And it'd be nice to put those together then with some of the things that we've come up with in the time that we've been talking about it. Well-being and healing is coming in as well. Developing non-human perspectives. Great, and these are the many of the ideas that we'll be talking about over the next few minutes. Some of the things that Phoebe and I came up with. We're thinking about learning about the living world, developing that love of the living world, soothing anxiety potentially, so that also fits in with the ideas about well-being. To inform, to empower, to give students agency, perhaps in negotiating environmental issues. We want to challenge and deepen their environmental thinking, and we want to help them make connections between social injustice and the environment. And there's creativity mentioned there in the chat as well, which I think is really important. We can find so much stimulus in writing about the natural world. Thank you. And this list that we've come up with, we could also loosely think about as being perhaps increasing in complexity or increasing in terms of age appropriateness. So you might start with very young children. The research suggests you start by, first of all, fostering that connection with and love of the living world. And then as children get older and become young adults or younger adults, then we might start to think about some of the complexities, to think about injustice, to think about deepening their thinking. And exploring all the nuances of kind of environmental perspective. So we might roughly see that as kind of building as students get older as well. So thank you for all those suggestions, and hopefully again those ideas are going to be in play throughout the session. And there's one more reason as well that's really important. What we talked about there is what we're offering our students when we do this, but it's also really important, we think, that reading about climate and nature is an important way to enhance English teaching and make it really relevant and make it really rich for our students. So it also enhances that brilliant subject that we teach at the same time. And ultimately, we're hoping that when we do this kind of work and when we read about climate and nature, that we're going to develop our students' eco-literacy. And that's a term that's been defined in lots of different ways, but one of my favourite definitions is actually a very simple one from Rhea Dunkley, who's a geographer, who says, really, this is about developing a knowledge that humans are connected to everything else on the planet. Animals, insects, plants, rocks, everything. And of course, that includes all other diverse human communities as well. So I find that a useful starting point to think about. What we really want is to open up student engagement with how everything is interconnected, and we and our societies are really interconnected with the living world that we are a part of. And while this obviously then informs and enhances kind of eco-literacy, it's also a perspective that hopefully offers students a lot of nourishment. And again, well-being and healing were mentioned in the chat So Greta Gard, who's a kind of feminist eco-pedagogy scholar, suggests that when we learn about climate and nature as well, we develop the resilience that can only be found through a connected self-identity, connection with and joy in nature, and connection across cultures. And we'll be talking a bit later as well about some of those relationships between sort of place and identity as being really powerful. So we think those are some of the reasons why we should hopefully be doing this work in the classroom, and why it's a rich and kind of exciting project. When we talk about climate nature, we also don't just mean, say, climate change, global heating, or nature with a capital N, something that's kind of out there, something that's rural necessarily. We're thinking really broadly about the whole kind of web of the living world in which we're connected. So if I offer you a set of keywords, some potential keywords, again, just one more sort of starting engagement. Be great if you could pick one or two of those keywords and again, write down what sort of books come to mind when you think about some of those themes or concepts. Are there texts that immediately come to your mind when you think about land or food or energy or animals? And we can think in this really broad ecological way about all the different kinds of ideas that come into play under this broader heading.
It's quite strange, isn't it, Megan? Because we can't see the names. Can you see the names of the attendees? So as you're making your suggestions, we can't actually see your names. But our mutual friend to start off with, which I recently re-listened to, and it's yeah, deeply connected with waste and resources. So really, yeah, great choice. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're right. I've got the same thing. It says attendee for all of us rather than, so we can't call you by your name, sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it is often, again, that's a great example, isn't it, of a text that you wouldn't be the first thing you think of, perhaps under the heading of climate and nature, but actually once you start expanding those definitions, think about how we're engaged in materials, resources, and the kind of
circular resource
circulation,
as well.
yeah, the circulation of stuff and living stuff. Hard times. Yeah, interesting that Dickens has been actually the thing that comes to mind, and we are going to do a bit of Dickens later on. So we hopefully that's given you a sense of where we're starting from, that we have quite an expansive definition of what might be broadly ecological, and that we need to be critical readers and our students need to be critical readers of how the texts that we choose and how we read them can reflect and sort of shape our assumptions and our cultural values about all of these different topics and the living world more broadly. So those are our starting points. We're going to sort of move on now to our first major section and to think more deeply about where we might find the opportunities to connect with some of these themes and ideas within the curriculum and some of the challenges that presents as well. So it's at this point that I'm going to hand over to Nicole, who's going to talk for a few minutes about the research that she started doing with training teachers on this subject. Is that all right, Nicole, if I hand over?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Megan. And I will try the few minutes and keep it to that. I teach on the English PGCE here in the department, and in order to facilitate the reasons why we think young people should be reading about climate and nature and develop their critical analysis of it, we need to train our teachers to think about it. A lot of teachers don't teach it in the same way that they don't teach diversity because they don't have the knowledge or they lack the confidence. So we want to gauge from our students where they were at with that. And so we did this a couple of years ago. Phoebe and Megan, for the last couple of years, have delivered a session but on the text and the ways in which the interns can incorporate it into their teaching. So about 10 weeks into their term on PGCE, week before Phoebe and Megan were due to come in, we asked a questionnaire of where does climate and nature fit into any lessons that you've observed and what was the topic being covered. Thank you, Megan. And these were some of their responses. I will let you read that. It is no surprise that some poetry has popped up, in particular with the Power and Conflict AQA anthology. I also don't think it's it's not a surprise that it's come up in Macbeth, and nor in, which one did I just see? Context for literature studies. Thank you, Megan. We then wanted to know before the session what they thought or had learned in relation to what might be the role of the English teacher. So we want to know what they thought the role of the English teacher was in supporting students that they teach to navigate their life through climate and nature. And this was the first lot of responses. Thank you, Megan. They said, it's not been covered in lessons I observed. When I asked my mentors, they said the curriculum focused on diversity instead. And there was a very strong opinion that it's not the role of the teacher to encourage any particular perspective. That was in the minority. The majority, however, had a different opinion on it. Thank you, Megan. Which was, like with social justice issues, we should try and present, and best to present content that fosters a broad awareness. And it's something that teachers should be aware of and understand. It's a point of anxiety for many young people. I think that the three of us definitely are in that. We are very much in that latter half. And it is really important that teachers are aware and have that understanding in order to support young people confidently, the teachers confidently through their reading and the climate and environmental issues. So thank you, Megan. A week before Megan and Phoebe came into the session, we asked them to observe some lessons, English teaching and across English, and if they could note were any lessons where climate and nature had been included. And these were some of the findings from it. Thank you, Megan. A text called number 7. I think unsurprisingly, they saw it in PC and geography. In English, direct personal responses and speeches, which links to the next point on rhetoric, and some transactional writing, where there'd been a lot of discussion prior to the writing about nature and the preservation of nature. They're the things that they'd seen. We then asked them to interview their English curriculum lead about how, where, and when they may seek to consider and discuss with their department where nature and climate might fit into the English classroom. And these were the responses. Thank you, Megan. I will let you read that rather than read it out to you. I think there's two interesting things for me. One, actually, the main important thing I think is it's the 4th bullet point. The department wanted to prioritize it more, but ultimately did not. And I think partly it's curriculum pressures, teachers not knowing where and how to incorporate it into their teaching. And for some reason, Year 7 seems to be this playground where you can experiment with any topic at all. And for some reason, it might be inconsequential because you're not necessarily thinking about GCSE. Okay, so we also then asked them, thank you, Megan. Which one am I on? Okay, where they had seen some of climate being taught in the classroom. Sorry, am I on slide 4, Megan? Hang on. Nope, I'm not. I'm on slide 5.
Is that which one? Sorry, which one do you want? Do you want me to go back on?
No, that's fine. That's fine. So after the session, we asked them to then focus on where they may have seen, with a more kind of nuanced eye and understanding, where they may have seen some of climate, nature, environment being discussed. These were the responses. Have we missed a slide? So there's some really easy ins. There's some really easy ways into incorporating it into English teaching. And I think for me, the final kind of finding that emerged from it was that it is not about a whole unit of work that is entitled Climate, Nature and the Environment. It is about embedding it into teaching. And in the same way that we would with any issues of diversity, it is about constant awareness of it and seeing the small ways in which it can be incorporated into the teaching. And I think, therefore, it's really, really important that we do continue teaching this session each year with our interns so that they develop their awareness and can spread that through their departments. So there are our findings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Just going back to that for a moment, it is really interesting. Every time we do come in and speak to the students, and we kind of find we're negotiating this relationship between all the sort of possibilities that there are for engaging these topics, and then all the kind of pragmatic realities that, you know, student teachers and teachers more generally encounter in sort of tackling or changing or perhaps kind of renewing their curriculum. So I think it's really useful, this kind of data we start to get from, you know, seeing what teachers actually find when they go into schools and where they kind of actually perceive those opportunities to lie. And it's not surprising that, as you say, that poetry anthology has come up a few times, and we'll be returning actually to the power and conflict anthology a little bit later in the next section, because it seems to be a really rich site for exploring how we might do this a little bit more than we currently do it at present. So to round off this first section, Phoebe and I are going to talk about some specific text choices that we think make really good opportunities for exploring these issues in the curriculum. And I'm going to start by talking about 2 young adult novels, both of which I think already have some relative popularity with schools and certainly with sort of younger readers. So sort of thinking around Key Stage 3. And I'm just going to briefly talk about each novel and how I see it having so much potential for kind of rich ecological exploration, while also thinking about them as really engaging, well-written texts that appeal to those readers. So it's quite useful to know, actually, if how many of you happen to know Wolf Brother, first of all, as a text. So I don't know if you know it, actually, to make my life simpler, if you know it, could you just write Wolf Brother in the chat, and then after the first person's done that, anyone else can give it a thumbs up, but saves me doing too many things at once. So if you know Wolf Brother, if you're familiar with it or taught it, do feel free to just pop that in the chat, and other people can respond as well. For those of you who don't know it, it's a popular young adult, well, this is the start of a popular young adult series that's set in kind of Mesolithic Scandinavia about 6,000 years ago. And it's a world in which these kind of mobile human clans live in different natural landscapes and very much embedded in their larger ecosystems. And the adventure narrative is focused, certainly in the first book, around how this world is kind of imperiled by a demon from the other world, which comes in the shape of a monstrous bear. So in many ways, it's a very familiar kind of young adult narrative, a heroic adventure, kind of episodic narrative. It's got intrepid, courageous young protagonists facing a lot of obstacles. And it's also got, as one of its protagonists, a wolf cub who's a foster brother to the hero, Torak. And one of the things I think is particularly useful about this series is it illuminates a kind of a way of thinking about the world and a set of practices that kind of we might think of it as sort of roughly indigenous. So we don't have in Britain, obviously, a kind of living indigenous tradition like many other countries around the world. But life in Mesolithic Britain was probably fairly similar to Mesolithic Scandinavia. So it maybe gives us a little bit of access to some of that traditional ecological knowledge that's been lost kind of in modernity. And I'm just going to run through a few ways I think we can, 5 kind of reference points for the novel that make it effective for teaching. So the first of them is it's a really great opportunity to think about how particular animal species have cultural sort of status or cultural mythology around them. The wolf is a particularly kind of iconic and often a particularly kind of troped species, right? Carries a lot of cultural baggage in the way it's been depicted, often in stories for children as malevolent, bloodthirsty, and so on. It's very different from the portrayal in the novel, and there are other traditions as well of wolf narratives, but you know, there's so much rich sort of cultural material there to work with in thinking about how we understand other species as a society. And then because we have a wolf cub who's such a prominent part of the novel, it's a lovely way to explore the idea of more than human perspectives. So the wolf in the novel has a narrative voice of his own. Some of the chapters are focalized from his point of view. And so we get these opportunities to think and talk in the classroom about what it might be like to experience the world as Wolf. And at the same time, we're exploring all those rich, different techniques that authors have of representing consciousness of different people and more than people, different species, different life forms. And the wolf has his own kind of vernacular and style of language, which really helps you to focus in on the idea of the world is constructed through language. And it obviously is different depending on the way that you perceive the phenomena around you. So really lovely narrative voice. And I found certainly my students really connected with reading that narrative voice and getting that sort of insight into the possible way of being of another species. And so I already mentioned that the kind of belief framework of the novel, we might call it animist. It's a sort of belief system in which heroism is very much aligned with compassionate animism. So to be heroic is to really respect all life and to really be reverent towards all life. And that means animal life, tree life, everything around being kind of living and having spirits, and that sort of suffuses all of the social practices that are in the novel as well. So it really, again, provides some really interesting reference points for how in human history, very often there's been not only much greater dependence on the environment, but just different ways of thinking about it. And obviously some of those are still very much alive today as well in other indigenous traditions. So it helps us think about relationships with place, relationships with more than humans, and the idea of the world as alive. And alongside that, there's this real attention to how resources are used and thought about. So we have the young hero killing his first deer and being incredibly meticulous about every part of the body becomes some useful item, some important, has some important function that helps him survive, whether it's the flesh being smoked, or the hide being used for rope and fishing wire, the bladder for a tinder pouch, and the liver for the clan guardian or the spirits. So it's got that spiritual dimension as well. And it's really interesting to think with students about where things come from. And the eco-philosopher of language, David Abram, says we really ought to be thinking about sources more than resources. Everything comes from a source. And it's easy to forget that, but really connects you much more in this novel to the idea of what are the material things that make our lives possible. And I've always found it really compelling to compare this to a living Indigenous tradition where the ideas of harvest and careful cultivation of resources is really prominent. And finally, a suggestion for this novel is to read it quite critically as well, in terms of tropes in books that can unwittingly be quite unhelpful from an environmental point of view. So we have these intrepid, heroic children who've got to save the world. And that's actually a really familiar trope across lots of literature. You know, what happens when we kind of make it the children's job to do that incredibly bold, kind of courageous job on their own, often as a kind of outcast from society. So we can ask critical questions about why that isn't depicted as a kind of shared intergenerational responsibility, or indeed an adult responsibility. Yeah, some suggestions for how Wolf Brother can really bring alive a lot of those conversations in the classroom. And I'm just having a look as well, there's some great wolf suggestions going on the chat. I think wolves generally would make a brilliant unit because there's great other texts, and I love the wolf border as well. Whoever's posited that, thank you for that suggestion. That's one of my favourite novels. So that's Wolf Brother. And another favourite of mine is Where the World Ends, which is a beautiful novel, again, one set in a different historical period, this time in St Kilda in Scotland. And it's based on a sort of small historical detail about a fowling party who go to a remote sea stack to get lots of seabirds on which their community depends, and then no one comes from their community to pick them up. So it's about a narrative of survival in very kind of bleak, harsh weather and physical conditions, and what happens to kind of society under that stress. Again, it's got some wonderfully sort of ecological themes that can bring alive a lot of conversation in the classroom. And the first of these is abundance. So the novel's absolutely teeming with bird life, thousands upon thousands, and there's so much rich and interesting vocabulary about abundance and kind of biodiverse richness. So it really is educational about Britain's native bird life, but it also really foregrounds that sense of a time when we were surrounded by really teeming, bursting, sort of abundant bird life. And as the bird's natural migration patterns kick in, and there's this kind of abundance turns into anxiety about a lack of resources. It really kind of concentrates discussion on how we've often been very reliant on the living world for our survival, but we obviously much more detached from that today, even though we still depend very much on the living world for our survival. And it's an opportunity to introduce ecological concepts like shifting baselines. Our kind of assumption that wildlife populations are sort of normal in our lifetime is often quite mistaken. So there's opportunities, if you want to really go into borrowing kind of knowledge from other subjects, like biology and ecology, and thinking about those concepts alongside literature. And then along that goes, sadly, the theme of extinction. So there's a very prominent bird, the gairfowl, that becomes a kind of important companion to a main character. And that's also known as the great auk, a bird that went extinct in the 1840s because of overhunting, and again has strange sort of cultural ideas attached to it. There's a lot of superstition in the novel. The bird is thought of as a sea witch, and there's a scene of very frenzied violence, which is a bit Lord of the Flies. Sorry about the spoiler, but again raises really interesting ideas about human attitudes towards particular species. Thank you for the thumbs up in the chat for Where the World Ends. I'm glad there's some other fans out there. I think it's a wonderfully written novel. Like Wolf Brother, it raises lots of questions about resources and our dependency on the natural world for our resources. Again, something that's still true, but we're much more sort of detached from that immediacy. And it talks about kind of the attitudes of older generations towards assuming resources are there for their consumption. There's also a lot of rich language and imagery, personification, and one of the strands of that I think is fascinating through the novel is the way it begins to blur distinctions between boy and bird. So through those uses of imagery, the kind of borders of species and human and more than human begin to come under pressure. And finally, really importantly, helps us think through how do societies survive in crisis. And a major tool for that in the novel is the role of storytelling and the role of the imagination. And that's in many ways what we're doing when we engage with this in English, is we're thinking about how important stories are to help us navigate the crisis that we find ourselves in, where climate and nature are in danger. And stories are going to be one of the ways we can really navigate, hopefully, ways through that. So two rich and quite beautiful novels that open up a lot of really interesting, meaty kind of topics for discussion, and a lot of interesting parallels between sort of historical societies and where we find ourselves now. So they would be two recommendations. And now we're going to move on. I'm going to ask Phoebe a little bit about her experience of teaching Ghost War, which is, I think, a new part of your curriculum this year. Is that right?
Well, actually, we introduced it last year, taught it to all Year 9 students. So I teach at Cheney, which is a comprehensive in Oxford here in the UK. And yeah, Ghost War's a bit of a gift of a book in the sense that it's not too long. It's about 147 pages of quite large text, actually. So it's very readable within a term. And it's many things, including a coming of age story. So it follows 17-year-old Sylvie, who has been brought to an experimental archaeology undergrad encampment in Northumberland, because her father's a self-taught enthusiast, and so he's volunteered them to kind of run the camp. So having grown up, she's from north of Manchester, Rochdale. She's from a working class background. Her dad's a bus driver and her mum is a cashier in local supermarket. She's had a relatively sheltered upbringing. She's plunged into the situation where she's living off the land with various undergrad students who are mostly from the south. Unlike her, she's a northerner. And like Wolf Brother, there's lots of interesting things to explore about connections to place and survival, how you can live off the land, how knowledge of a landscape and everything that it offers can kind of give you confidence and strength. And that's something that Sylvie has very much learnt from her father, with whom she has a difficult relationship. But the book is also exploring ideas about borders and divides within landscapes. it was written just after the Brexit vote in 2016, and it's set just after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the early 90s. So there's lots to think about in terms of the things that we might be reaching for when we're looking at history to help foster a sense of identity, ideas of what it means to be British, which is something that Sylvie's dad is really struggling with as a kind of disenfranchised working class man in post-industrial Northern England. And he's also, and Sylvie kind of bears the brunt of that as he's learning perhaps where the boundaries are between him and his daughter, and how much kind of control he can expect to have over her body and her choices. So there's lots of things that the students find really, really interesting to explore. And it's also it feels very relevant. And I think that it also kind of gives you an opportunity to help them share their own experiences of places that they're connected to, places that they understand, different types of knowledge, divides in educational privilege, divides in background, divides in kind of expectations and opportunities that different people have. So yeah, I think it works well, and I'd really recommend it.
Thank you. Did you find, if this is the second year, have you found that you've kind of changed much of what you did with it in response to how the students liked it, or is it?
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the challenges with the book actually is that it's written in almost like a kind of stream of consciousness with a lot of indirect speech. So it's quite a hard book to read to the class, and you need to make sure you're ready to summarize and able to read ahead. So I think, it's a text that a couple of readings stand you in good stead. I think we tested it with a small group and then taught it for the whole year. And I'm trying to think if we have changed anything else. I don't know. Our assessment question, one of them is kind of asking them about portrayals of Englishness, and yeah, so I think kind of making them pay attention to the kind of where the different characters are drawing their identities from the very beginning. I think perhaps that's been emphasized a bit more in my second teaching, I would say.
It sounds like it's a really good crucible for showing how ideas about something like land or nature, landscape, are actually so interwoven with these other issues, because that's part of the problem. Is maybe sometimes nature is treated quite simplistically or quite as a thing that is distant in some way, whereas it sounds like they've responded to the idea that it's really, these things are all woven together: who we are, where we come from, what we've experienced. They can't be sort of disentangled in a way, so it kind of makes that very visible. Is that
Yeah, I think that's fair. And also there's a lot of tension in the novel of kind of the Sylvie's dad and kind of fighting for superiority with the professor. So there's kind of which ways of knowing are more privileged. But actually what turns out to be true is understanding the landscape you're in and how you can be resilient in it is kind of the most immediately useful, whereas the more kind of conceptual knowledge can perhaps help unpick certain unhelpful origin stories about who is more entitled to be in a place than anyone else, or who's been there longest, or so yeah, I think
fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And there's a couple of questions in the chat. Go on, Nicole.
Sorry, can I ask one question? Phoebe, was this novel a novel study, or was it a part of a different kind of unit of work and that you embedded it in?
No, we taught it as a shared text, as a complete unit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, if you're happy to respond to them as well, maybe either in the chat. I found I can't type, strangely, so I can't answer. Just to go back a few questions, the question about year 7 with the previous novels. Wolf Brother, I've taught with year 7. Where the World Ends, I've taught with year 8. It would work up to year 9, definitely. So generally, Key Stage 3, there's a bit of flexibility there. Wolf Brother's probably a bit younger, sometimes even taught in year 6. So that I'd say year 7. And I think you taught Ghost Wall with year 9, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah.
in terms of assessment questions that are linked more explicitly to climate and nature, there are questions throughout our teaching of it about how Sarah Moss explores connections to place or different ways of knowing, different provocations about perhaps understanding of place, or I don't know, how a character is presented with reference to their survival skills, that kind of thing. Yeah, so interwoven lots of things around that. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on then. So hopefully that's given you a sense of some a bit more of a deep dive into some texts that we really recommend. We're going to nip back at the end to looking at a snapshot of a few more titles, and we're also going to share a reading list with you where we've written some hopefully useful blurbs for some of the titles that we recommend. So a bit more of that at the end. What we're going to do now is move on to just thinking about how we might read some of the texts that are already there. So one answer to the what to read for climate nature is read what's already in your curriculum, read what you're reading already, but maybe with some slightly different slants, some slightly different approaches. So drawing a little bit on what we've talked about already, but this is where we'd also like to hand over to you in a few minutes, and we're going to work with you in smaller groups to discuss some more familiar texts. So just to start this off, I was going to give you an example of this approach from the AQA Power and Conflict anthology, which again is probably something that's familiar to some of you, maybe not to all of you, but is a very commonly taught poetry anthology at GCSE in England. And we have come back to this anthology a few times. It was mentioned in Nicole's survey as being like one of the sites where people thought this is definitely in play. But I've also had teachers say to me, how do we get away from the way it can often be framed in this anthology as a kind of oppositional man versus nature, right? That's a very familiar kind of binary that comes up in assessing some of these poems and more generally. And that's something we'd really like to try and move away from, the idea that these are kind of oppositional forces, because of course we are part of nature. So can we break down those binaries? So I'm going to give you a really brief example of a poem from Power and Conflict that I think could be approached a bit differently in this spirit. And then we're going to have a look at 3 different texts, familiar texts probably again, or oftenly taught texts, and just try and think together about how they could be approached through some of these questions. So Power and Conflict, I chose, when I was looking at this anthology, I chose to think about the poem that actually comes at the end, I think, Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. Some of you will know it, some of you might not. I'm going to give you just a minute to read through the poem in case it's a new one. So just a minute of reading, and then I'll just very briefly say how I suggested approaching it from a different angle. So a quick bit of reading time first, unless anyone would love to read it aloud. What do you reckon? Do we get a volunteer?
It's just difficult. I think there's like a sentence, a line here or there, which is slightly out of.
Oh, just at the top. Sorry, it's done that thing.
That's okay. So it might make it hard.
It might make it hard. Let me just recover what that line is as well. The one that's missing, is it just the one at the top rather than the one at the bottom right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So the one at the top should say, and remembered how he and his brothers. So the line above, and his brothers, and remembered how he and his brothers. Sorry about that. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to just give it a quick read through, a quick whiz through. And I just wanted to say something about how this is a poem that, although it kind of typically taught thinking about the historical context, which is very relevant, thinking about how it's a poem about a Japanese kamikaze fighter pilot who's on a suicide mission, and as depicted in the first stanza, and then makes the decision to turn back and returns to this kind of social shame and social kind of ostracizing at the end of the poem. And I wanted to approach this poem with a sense of what happens if we don't always start with a kind of human story. So I'll in the most loose of annotations, I just wanted to call your attention to this idea of starting in the middle of the poem. I really wanted to start with the center of the poem and thinking about the more than human, or the more than human entangled with the human. So actually starting this poem thinking about the fish. To me, in a poem that's actually about life and death, the fish are the most vivid, kind of alive parts of this text, really vividly depicted. So I want to start with thinking about kind of images of what they might look like, and thinking about the language that actually depicts these fish, and how the fish are at the center in some ways of this really interesting vision of an ecosystem, a kind of interconnected ecosystem. So we have our fishing boats on a coastal community, we have our swarms and shoals of fish, we have the kind of artisan fishing community, and in what I think is depicted as a very sustainable kind of interconnected ecosystem, because the sense of over generations, those fish stocks are still really abundant. So again, abundance very prominent here, awash with all those mackerel and prawns and so on, and the dark muscular tuna. So actually thinking about this as a vision of an interconnected, maybe sustainable ecosystem in which human families and communities are connected to more than human life, and they're all quite interconnected. And if we start with that vision and then kind of zoom up to where the pilot is in the sky, and we get a glimpse maybe of what is it about that looking down, that act of looking down, and what he sees when he's looking down, that changes the whole course of his life, that is powerful enough to transform the course of his life, which, you know, socially speaking is very difficult. But it was a kind of experiment in what if the more than human life in a poem takes up our attention first, and we start to read how humans are affected by their entanglement with that life. So that's just perhaps one brief example of how it might be fun to take a different starting point with a poem, and to deliberately kind of sometimes displace the human individual, and see if that way in can sometimes open up just fresh or interesting ways of thinking about it. And I mentioned in general this question of kind of man and nature and how they're related or oppositional is something that comes up a lot in the anthology. I think rather than have much of a conversation about that now, it might be a good time to move to the breakout rooms and look at some other texts, and perhaps when we come back we could talk about the challenges of trying to think about this differently. Does that sound right, Phoebe, Nicole? So if we could, Joe, if at this point we could open up the breakout rooms, and we're going to have 3 rooms, and we've got 3 different texts, so that each room will have a nice small group for discussion and 1 text to think about. And I'm also including in those texts, with those texts, sorry, some prompt questions. So some of these will be more relevant than others, but encouraging you as a group, and one of us will be in each room as well, just to spend maybe 10 minutes thinking about some of these questions in relation to the extract that you've been given. They are live Google documents. So it'd be great if you feel able to add some notes in. If you open up the documents on your screen, and you can add your notes very freely, more than one person can add notes, but it'd be nice to capture a sense of what the discussion is. But it'd be great just if you can connect with each other in talking about how some of these prompts opens up ways of thinking about text that might seem familiar. So hopefully everyone will start filtering back into the main room.
Can I just say thank you to my group for their contributions? I didn't manage to do that before we moved back in, so thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Nicole.
likewise.
I know I probably didn't feel like enough time, as inevitably the way. I suspect there was all sorts of things going on, and I don't know if you had a chance to write anything down either, but don't worry if you didn't. It'd be really nice just to hear a little snapshot from each group of what kind of ideas bubbled up. Maybe just a minute from each group. Does that seem realistic? If anyone wants to nominate themselves, or if Nicole and Phoebe, you want to, I don't know, you might have an idea of who is best placed to feedback within your group.
We kind of volunteered Kat from our group. We were looking at A Christmas Carol. Kat, are you happy to talk? Do you want to go first? Oh, is she going to be able to unmic herself?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
should be able to unmute.
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, unmute.
Thanks. I was just double checking.
Yeah.
So yes, we were looking at A Christmas Carol. So I think it was really poignant in the sort of sample text that we got, the impacts of pollution, especially the use of coal, so a fossil fuel, and there was reference to the winter having layers and layers of snow, and we discussed how obviously our winters have changed to be more wetter, milder, and I think that would be a really interesting talking point. The sort of second point was, in what ways is the place connected with identity? So that human mood is intertwined with the natural world, and people feel more gloomy and sort of affected by the climate and the sort of smog in the city. And then the last sort of point, which I discussed with Lisa, and sorry, I've forgotten your name, who led our session.
Phoebe.
So Phoebe. So we were just discussing about the mention of seasonal produce. So in the text it mentioned pears and apples, and I think that'd be a really interesting talking point with the students about the link with our variability and access to numerous goods now that are imported, and that impact of food miles and the importance of trying to locate things more seasonally and locally in your area and your community.
Thank you. That was a really clear and coherent summary. I found myself fascinated. Where did their grapes come from? Anyway, that was, probably what you do. Thank you.
I know
for that.
you used to get fruit ships into Cornwall, didn't you? Into Falmouth, and that's where all the oranges and lemons would come in and up through Cornwall. I was in the news this morning, actually. They were talking about how orange prices have gone right up because there's a disease that is affecting lots of oranges. That is made worse by the changing climate.
Food insecurity, and food is a fascinating topic, isn't it, across so many texts. Thank you. Okay, shall we do Shakespeare or the poems? Should we do Shakespeare briefly? I had a good chat with Eve and Alexander. Would either of you like to just briefly kind of summarize what we talked about? 2 or 3 ideas?
We started with the idea that actually in the extract that we looked at, Prospero refers to Caliban as Earth, and this idea that actually as Earth, as the son of Sycorax, he answers back to the human, and just considering that idea of the Earth or an animal or a more than human other being able to answer back, and what that then leads to in terms of conversation and interaction between the human and the more than human. And we also thought about the way in which the island is affected by human activities, and Megan mentioned the focus on logging and on cutting trees and carrying firewood, and this idea of deforestation that happens sort of almost unseen and under the sort of like surface of the plot. And then we talked briefly about the idea of a sort of post-colonial perspective on the Tempest, whereby identity is closely linked to the landscape, and Caliban in some way sort of is tricked into sort of sharing his knowledge of his land, and enabling colonizers to come in and take control of it, which you see ultimately at the beginning of the plot in The Storm, when Prospero wields the sort of the wind and the rain in order to sink the ship.
Thanks so much, Eve, again for rounding up the strands of the conversation. And finally, the poetry, a couple of poems, Owen Shears and Thomas Hardy.
Does anybody from our group want to discuss it? Okay, I will go then. We chatted with Wild Swans about the kind of negative effects of the abuse of the environment and how the stanzas play well into highlighting that. I particularly like the way in which, even though there's so much about nature, humans still kind of came out as quite powerful within this poem. And then with neutral tones, actually, and also with Winter Swans, kind of like the poetry is kind of the subject, but then it changes to be the object as it serves to become a kind of a purpose service humans. And in neutral tones, we didn't spend as much time on it, but one point was made about the starving sod and how nature is quite hungry and is lifeless because the sod's starving under this kind of waterlogged earth, and how that reflects kind of the emptiness of human emotions.
Thank you. There's a lot of projection, isn't there? They're really interesting, the way that like our emotions are entangled with how we perceive the world, and how we perceive the world is so filtered by what we're feeling and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's so much richness there. And again, please obviously take those texts away. We'll include the links to them in what we send you afterwards, so you can play around with them and have a further think about the ones you haven't had a chance to read. Just sort of as we finish off, we did start a few minutes late, but I don't want to keep you late because I know that people will have lots to do. Just to kind of introduce you to the remaining ideas we had about a scattering of texts that can introduce loads of ideas from different perspectives. So I'm just going to run through the remaining slides as examples of different categories or different approaches. We'll send you a reading list that has most of these texts on, with a little explanatory blurb that therefore gives you a sense of what that book might be good for. But we play around all the time with different ways of sort of categorizing texts that might work. So one way, for example, of course, is thinking about future scenarios and the genre of dystopia, which could be a whole webinar in itself. The complexities of thinking about eco-dystopia, which is sometimes useful and sometimes problematic, perhaps. But there's lots of interesting texts out there. We've thought about how more than humans themselves are kind of a category of reading that can be really interesting to explore. So again, you'll get the copy of all these book titles, don't worry about notes, but there's so many different ways in which writers are now playing around with representing more than human perspectives. And that goes all the way from sort of childhood literature up to, very literary adult novels and everything in between, but ways of introducing those. We also thought about ways of reading contemporary society and expanding, obviously, across sort of international diverse contexts. So there's a range of different texts there that speak to that in different ways. And thinking about past societies, which is something we touched on already. Past societies, particularly also in other cultures where we see, like The Tempest, some of that particularly colonial activities playing out and changing relationships with land and identity. And of course, speculative societies, how might the world look differently than it does? We also thought more generally about reading intimate relationships with place, which is something we also get typically in some of these novels about past societies. But again, really interesting kind of reading choices for students where there's real intimacy in how people are related to their landscapes. We've also thought a little bit about non-fiction and what texts work well in the classroom to introduce a range of ways of thinking about the natural world, elements of the natural world, but in kind of more diverse contexts as well. So all of that you can take away in terms of reading suggestions. As I said, the reading list has got little blurbs for lots of these texts to give you a bit more of a flavour about what they're about and what they're good for. There's also a kind of model in there from one critic I mentioned earlier who suggests a way of evaluating what texts you're going to use in the classroom. You can sometimes ask yourself these 3 key questions: how it presents human identity in relation to nature and diverse other cultures. Does it have some kind of eco-justice? Is it just about individuals or is it about community? And how is nature represented as subject or object, which kind of informed the prompts earlier. So that's one way of evaluating what you'd like to read and to teach. So you can think about that in more detail as well. In terms of what next, I'll send you that reading list. And in fact, I'm going to put the link, I can put the link here, but we'll also send it out as a set of resources at the end. And in fact, it doesn't seem to let me. We're going to send it to you because it's not letting me post the link for now. Also, we also do quite a bit of work with the UCL Centre for Climate Change Sustainability Education. So their new website will have English modules for teacher training coming out soon. So keep an eye on that link. And if you want to contact us for further conversations, we always love talking to teachers about what they're doing in the classroom and, you know, what's actually going on in terms of books that are working to explore these topics. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's brilliant to meet other teachers who want to think about this and start including it in their curriculum. I think Joe is putting the feedback form in the chat, but there's also a QR code there, if that's convenient. And also more links that Hamish shared with you at the beginning of how to stay in touch with the Deanery. But we're really pleased to have had you along to the webinar this evening, and there will be a recording as well as the link, so you can obviously share that with other interested colleagues and do encourage more people to join the conversation. Thank you so much.